Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. This is the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C. My name is Bill Courtney. I'm on the board of directors. We are particularly pleased to have Dr. Leslie Gelb with us this evening to speak to you and to a wider audience across America on World Affairs Today, a program which reaches, I believe, 40 million American households. Dr. Gelb came to Washington, D.C. after getting a PhD from Harvard University, came in 1966 as an assistant to Senator Jacob Javits from New York, moved on and up, became Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs, later in the Department of State, National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, and was on the editorial board of the New York Times. And then president of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. He has written quite a lot, including an early book on Vietnam, the system working, and more recently a broader book on power in international relations. We're very pleased to have Dr. Gelb. He will speak for a little bit, and then we'll do questions and answers and welcome your comments and suggestions. Please use the mic over here to my left, to the right of many of you. Thank you very much. Dr. Gelb?
If you don't want to use the mic while I'm speaking, you can just shout in disagreement. I entered this profession some time ago in the thought that it was the easiest thing I could imagine doing in college. Everyone who was a government major, specialized in international relations, didn't seem to have to do any work. So it looked like a perfect profession for me. And it also seemed, the more I learned about it, to be a profession where if you made a lot of mistakes, either no one noticed or no one cared. Foreign affairs, while it's done some great things for the United States, has also done things at great cost to our country. And only after having made more than my share of mistakes have I come to the notion that one ought to know something before one acts. It would revolutionize American foreign policy. I want to talk to you tonight about the one thing that I think is most important to know about the world in order to make a decent foreign policy. And that is that for the first time in history, economics, money, gross domestic product have replaced military might as the principal coin of the international realm. That is a revolution. For almost all of history, the only thing that really mattered was whether you had the arms and the capability to go threaten and conquer your neighbors. Happened all the time. You needed money to do it, of course, but it was the force that counted. And it all kind of came together during the period of the Renaissance with the creation of the modern nation state. In fact, I was going to, once upon a time, write a book about the two watersheds in world history. One, the Renaissance period with the creation of the nation state and the systematic use of force as the heart of foreign policy, and post-Cold War era, where economics became the center of things. And you can see it back then in Machiavelli's writings. Machiavelli told the prince that when push came to shove, you only had to know one thing. Those are his words. You only had to learn one thing, and that is the art of war. And that's pretty much what leaders did forever thereafter. Then the Cold War ended, and almost without our knowing it, there were profound changes. So fast, so deep, we didn't see them. Let me give you 3 facts to prove my case. One, you may have noticed a country known as Greece in the newspapers recently. I don't remember Greece being in the newspapers since the days of the Truman administration, when the communist guerrillas seemed to threaten the viability of that state. And we had the Greek-Turkish aid bill and the beginning of the containment doctrine. But Greece has been quiet ever since, and it comes back into the headlines as the European Lehman Brothers company. It becomes important because, puny as it is, one of the most insignificant economies in Europe, it had the capacity to threaten the viability of the European economy. So all of a sudden, what happened in Greece and what others did with Greece has become the most important thing in Europe. Second, when we think of what we call the new emerging powers in the world, who are they? What are they? We have Brazil and Turkey and India, Russia to a degree, the BRIC countries. And they are emerging powers and major powers, not because of their military might, except for Russian military power on its borders. These countries don't have much military punch. But they are growing economic powers. And more, they are the dominant influence in their areas of the world. You read the headlines today about the Middle East, and they're much more about what Turkey can or can't do for the countries there than what the United States can or can't do. It's astonishing. In Brazil, the Brazilian economy now rivals that of almost all the other Latin American economies put together, almost without our knowing it. The Brazilians understood that they were into something quite new, astonishingly new, and they have for the last 2 or 3 years done something we haven't even thought of doing, which is to think about what their foreign policy should be now that they are a major economic power. And they're having a rather lively internal debate within the government and a public debate too, because they understand their economic growth has given them power in the region well beyond their imagination. It also means rethinking Brazil's relationship with us, because basically, if push came to shove, they did what we wanted in the past. And they did so not because they thought we were going to invade Brazil. Even that lay beyond the dreams of my colleagues in the US government, but because of our economic clout. Lastly, just think about this. China is considered a world power now. Everyone says so, and it is. But it is a world power without being a global military power. It's got no military power around the world. Its military power is restricted to its borders. It's building up its military force now, but it can't do much beyond its borders. And it's at least 2 decades behind the United States in military technology. They just don't compare to us. And yet China is considered a world power, and it is. The first time in history you've had a global power that didn't begin to be a global military power. Think about that. The Chinese certainly have. And the Chinese spend most of their time not invading other countries. They don't know what it's like to be a great power. They'll finally learn once they start invading other countries. But right now, they're only interested in buying resources in those countries massively. Take a look at Iraq. We fought in Iraq for years, and to the extent anybody there feels they owe us anything, they didn't feel they owed us the possibility of buying their oil fields, the new oil fields that have come online in Iraq. Iraq sold those oil fields to China. In Afghanistan, last time I looked, we were still fighting a war there, and we were guarding one of the biggest copper mines in the world, our troops, one of our brigades. Guess who owns that copper mine? It's the Chinese. They bought it. You think they would send a brigade there to guard that copper mine? I don't think so. Or to send troops to protect their new oil fields in Iraq? I don't think so. So China has become a global military power by force of its internal economy, by force of what it can buy and sell. And that used to be American power. Just think of it. Go back to the Cold War. We were thought to be a great power in the Cold War, and we were. We were one of two superpowers. But there was another military superpower, the Soviet Union. We didn't dominate the world, because in the world controlled by the Soviet Union, they dominated it, despite our military power. But what we could do is tell most other countries in the world what to do because of our economic power. In Latin America and Asia, wherever. Even though we weren't, in effect, the sole global military dominator. Now we are. Now there isn't a country in the world that could begin to compete with the United States as a global military power, and yet we have less power or influence than we did during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union controlled nearly half the world. We have less influence today than we had then. And it's because our economy isn't as strong as it was then. And it all starts with that. About 6 months or so ago, when everybody was getting ready to celebrate John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, I went back and read it, and then I thought, you know, let me go back and read Eisenhower's farewell address also. It was given 3 days before the Kennedy inaugural. And I went back and read both, and I said, my heavens, Eisenhower's was the great speech, not Kennedy's. Go back and read them. Kennedy's speech was all about the world and all about the power we were going to exercise in the world. All about how we weren't going to let anybody push us around. All about how we would bear any burden anywhere in the world to fight for freedom. But not a thing about America. Eisenhower's farewell address was about America. And he said, the warning about the military-industrial complex, don't let it take over the country, but that was just part of his message. The reason why he was worried about the military-industrial complex was primarily because He was convinced that they would get the country to spend more and more on arms that we did not need, that we would turn ourselves into a military-industrial economy and lose our economic strength. And he warned about the military-industrial complex because it would take our focus off the continuing development of our domestic economy and our middle class, which was beginning to blossom at that time. You know, our early leaders, Eisenhower, Truman, Marshall, Acheson, they understood the way the world was going very well. Hadn't gotten there yet, but they could see it. What was the first thing they did, really, to deal with the Soviet threat? The first thing they did was not to establish NATO. That didn't come till 49 and 50. The first thing they did was the Marshall Plan and foreign aid. And why did they do that? Because they believed that the governments that we wanted to be our allies, the countries we wanted to be our allies, wouldn't be able to resist the Soviet Union unless their economies were restored. That their political stability depended upon their economic growth, and their viability as military allies depended upon both those things. So they put the emphasis on the Marshall Plan. It was an enormous investment by the United States, and we did the same thing with Japan. We built it up as an economic power again and avoided its becoming a military threat. It was an act of genius, an understanding of what power really is all about. Even at a time when we were more and more thinking like JFK, that it was military might that mattered. We lost all sense of when military might could help and when it couldn't. I was over in the Pentagon today talking to some of the senior officials there who had just come back from an NSC meeting. And they were lamenting the fact that they have to go over there 6, 7, 8 times a week for these interagency meetings. And I said, you know, you would have fewer meetings if people realized that there isn't much we can do about the problems you're talking about. But there's this illusion stemming from the Kennedy years, we can do it all, and particularly through force. How do you think about a world where military counts far less than it did before, where economics matters more? How do you think about foreign policy? How do you think about our security? Let's take Libya, and then I'll get to Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's talk about Libya. President Obama decided to go in to the Libya battle with France and Britain and the rhetorical promises of a bunch of Arab states. And then we became the centerpiece of the military operation there. We were the centerpiece because it is almost impossible to conduct sustained air operations anywhere in the world unless we're controlling those operations. We're the only ones who have the capability to do it. British and French couldn't have done it, either in Libya or anyplace else in the world. Now, why couldn't they do it? Because guess what they did since the end of the Cold War? They cut their military spending almost in half because they saw the world was changing. We increased our military budget. Military spending, if you count the 2 wars, almost doubled in the last 15 years. Higher than it has ever been before, when it means even less than it ever did before. So we went into Libya. How should we have thought about Libya? The argument put forward by the White House was that it was because of human rights. If we didn't enter that fray, there would be God knows how many people killed by Gaddafi, the monster. And the blood would be on our hands. Hundreds of thousands of dead. We were going into the war to save lives. Now, the White House didn't know any better than you or I how many people Gaddafi might have killed in revenge. In fact, he didn't know whether it would be more or less than are being killed in Syria or Yemen or any number of places that may erupt similarly in that part of the world. Didn't have any idea. But this was the argument he made in order to satisfy people who thought it was rather strange we were going into Libya when we had no vital interest involved there. And I say no vital interest involved there without any fear of contradiction. Gaddafi, of course, was a monster. No one argues that. But since the Lockerbie horror, he was our monster, which is one of the few reliable monsters the United States had in the world. He was one of the main sources of intelligence we had about terrorist operations. He was one of our main arms in preventing Muslims from his country and neighboring countries going to Afghanistan to fight us. He was the one who told us about A.Q. Khan, the chief nuclear scientist in Pakistan, providing technology and other nuclear material to a lot of our enemies. He was the one. Spilled the beans. Now, if we wanted to get rid of him, we could have done so at the time of Lockerbie. We had plenty of cause then. He also killed some of our servicemen in Berlin. But after that, he became a serviceable working ally. We don't know who the devil these people are who are going to replace them. It is one of the fashions of our news industry, particularly the mental deficients on cable news, to call them Democrats. They have no idea who they are. We and the British sent in troops. We sent in troops and agents by the dozens and then even more to find out who they were, because we hardly knew any of them. That's a fact. We hardly knew any of them. And what we did know as we went along was that a lot of them had Al-Qaeda affiliations and affiliations to extremist groups. Let's see what happens there. Let's see what that future is going to be. But the reason why we made all these excuses to get involved in something that was not a vital interest of the United States, to help a revolution where we didn't know the revolutionaries, was because we owed it to the French and British. They were determined to go in, and we owed them because they had helped us and were helping us in Afghanistan. They're major allies, and they said to us, look, you're not going to leave us in the lurch in Libya after we're helping you at enormous cost to ourselves in Afghanistan in a war that is extremely unpopular in our countries. So we owed them, and we did it. It wasn't that the cost is great, but in the economic situation we're in at home, every cost like that is great. It'll be well over $1 billion. How do you think about Afghanistan in the light of economic priorities? How important is I'm not in favor of just walking out of the place. You can't do that. You can't be the central support for a government and a people for 10 years and then just leave them entirely in the lurch. But we're now committed to being the main combat role in that country until the end of 2014. That's a long way away. It's a lot of lost lives and a lot of lost money. And you wonder what you're accomplishing. What are we doing there that supports anything resembling a vital interest? The young Marine who won the Medal of Honor was on 60 Minutes Sunday, and to hear his story really made you shudder, the heroism of it. It was almost like a good old World War II war movie. It was all good, what he was trying to do. And at the end of the interview, David Martin of CBS asked him, "So what did you think you accomplished in 2 years of fighting on the mountain edge of Afghanistan near the Pakistan border, where we put so many of our best soldiers and Marines?" And he paused and he paused, and you could see he did not want to give the answer. But he couldn't help himself, and he said, "Nothing." And if you ask soldiers coming out of there, that's now more and more a common answer. They're being put in the middle of nowhere to fight for nothing. I wrote a piece about a bunch of American soldiers who were killed a few months ago in the same region. And I wrote the story because the commanding general in the area, two-star general, made a public announcement that our troops were being withdrawn from that area after more than 2 years combat. And they were being withdrawn because, quote, "the area was not of strategic interest to the United States." We lost hundreds of lives there for an area that was not of strategic interest to the United States. It was a crime. And we're fighting there to protect Chinese copper mine. It's an old country that we can't change. We've never seemed to learn that lesson. Never seemed to learn that military might can't transform countries. We can win wars, but what transformed Germany, what transformed Japan, was what we did after we beat them. But there's certain wars you can't win. And we as Americans ought to understand that better than anyone else, because we were the victors in one of the first wars where people with almost no military power, almost no military capability, beat the most formidable army in the world. I think it was called the American Revolutionary War. We virtually had no army. You all know the Washington story. He tried not to fight. He adopted, in effect, guerrilla warfare. He won because the people in the colonies no longer wanted to be ruled by Britain, even though they had the strongest military force in the world. We were also close to another event that should have taught us the same lesson. It was Haiti. You know, there was a slave uprising in Haiti just about the same time. And the French couldn't handle the slave uprising. They were busy fighting other little things elsewhere. So guess who volunteered to go down and put down the slave uprising? Great Britain and the king. And the king sent an even bigger army to Haiti than he did to the colonies in order to put down the slave uprising. Guess what happened? The slaves beat them. When peoples don't want to be ruled and dominated by outsiders, they're prepared to pay an enormous price, way beyond the kind of price we're prepared to pay. Again, one would have thought we learned that lesson in Vietnam, but we didn't. Military force can punish, and I think it can deter. We were right to attack Kabul after 9/11 and punish al-Qaeda, and to go after al-Qaeda today, and when and as and where we can to kill them, because their aim is to kill us. But that doesn't mean massive land wars. And besides, if you believe in economic priorities, you can't do massive land wars. Again, I was over in the Pentagon today, and the U.S. military, at least the leaders of it, are far wiser than you think. There's a great lie afoot about the military in general, our country and other countries. It's that they're the hawks all the time. They want to get into war. And the truth of the matter is the military is almost always, particularly ours, is almost always against getting into a war. Anytime I've been in any situation where in an internal debate in our government, go to war, no go to war, do things that risk going to war, the military is almost always opposed. Even in Vietnam in 1956, when President Eisenhower had to decide whether we were going to replace the French in Indochina, he asked the military to speak to America's interest in the area, and the Joint Chiefs spoke in a formal document, and they said, and I quote, "Indochina is devoid of strategic interests to the United States." They said it just like that. But once in war, once the fighting begins, once the blood is spilled, then the military becomes the biggest hawks of all. And they become a real obstacle to ending the war because in their minds, and you have to think of it this way, the political leadership asked us to spill blood because they said vital American interests were engaged here. And now they're saying April Fool. Now they're saying all this was done in vain. We didn't have to do it. It's why every president gets trapped in this situation, because after the blood is spilled, it then becomes not just a strategic problem, the war, but a political problem as well. And that's the problem that restrains us from moving out of Afghanistan as fast as we should. And it's what keeps us discussing why we might want to keep a fairly substantial force in Iraq, even after the Iraqis have made it quite plain they don't want us. But if you're going to focus on what makes America powerful in the world, it's not those armies, it's not those wars. And it wouldn't be so even if we were winning those wars. Even if we prevailed in Iraq, even if we were to prevail in Afghanistan, even if we're the winning side in Libya, our power isn't going to change. It will go downhill until our economic situation at home starts to regenerate. That's what it's all about. When you look at what's happening in the UN now, the move by the Palestinian Authority to go to the Security Council and ask for recognition of Palestinian statehood. United States can do anything it wants militarily in that part of the world, but they're doing it because we no longer count to the Palestinians the way we used to. They can afford to just say no to us because there are other places they can turn to for economic assistance now. Other places that will be a bigger part of their future than the United States. Otherwise, they would never dare to do it. The question then becomes, the Eisenhower question. How do you fix up our economy at home? And I've never seen a dumber debate in the United States than the one in which we're presently engaged. Obviously, the fate of our democracy hinges on the result of that debate. Our children, our grandchildren will live in a country that is sort of like Britain, not the United States we grew up in, where it's barely proud of itself, where it can't do the things that makes it most proud. And we have this debate where the Republican side, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, I hate both parties with equal devotion. But the Republicans are arguing, for example, on the subject we're talking about, military power, that if there's a hair touched on the chair of the chinny chin chin of the defense budget, they're going to vote against the whole package. And if you look at that defense budget and talk to our own senior military people, they're fully aware that we've got to make changes in our military spending. They're more willing to do it than the loud mouths in Congress who say not by a hair on that chinny chin chin. They understand we have to change. They understand we don't want and shouldn't build armies and Air Force and Navy to fight major land wars. That the major powers don't exist to threaten us, and the other countries, well, we've seen the experience of the major land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've seen the Republican Party say that government stimulus spending is just a waste. It contributes to the deficit and debt. That the way to rebuild the economy is to cut taxes. At a minimum, keep them where they are, because those taxes are needed to make the investments to create the jobs. But on its face, that argument is, how can I put it kindly, kooky, because that money has been available for 10 or more years as it is. Those taxes have been cut for all that time. Our banks and businesses are flush with profits. They have not reinvested those profits to create new jobs, and they won't until they see that there will be an increase in demand. And there won't be an increase in demand until you create jobs. And since private industry is not going to create those jobs, the last resort is the government. We'd prefer it otherwise, but that's the last resort. And we're going to sink further and further into economic difficulty, and more countries will do what the Palestine Liberation Organization is doing, flaunting us, ignoring us. And the consequences are not only bad for us, they're bad for the world. A weak United States means that almost no problem in the world can get solved reasonably. Just think for a minute. There hasn't been a global free trade agreement since the decline in American economic power. You haven't had one. And the reason you haven't had a new free trade agreement is because our economic strength allowed us to make the compromises in past negotiations that led to the agreements. We were the ones who made the biggest compromises. And the reason we could make those compromises is because we had the strongest economy. And we knew that even though we would suffer to some degree in the short run, we'd more than make up for it in the long run. That we had a competitive economy that could handle itself in open competition. But now, no strong United States, no world trade agreements. All these problems within countries that could fester and become larger problems, terrorism, proliferation, weak states, nobody is going to do anything about it without American leadership. So these problems will fester and really put us into a very difficult situation down the line unless we fix ourselves up. Because today, economic power is the main currency of the international realm, and we really need a lot more currency. Thank you much.
Dr. Gelb is pleased to take questions.
Dr. Gelb, I'm Tom Reckford with the council here. First, thank you for a wonderfully eloquent, thoughtful tour d'horizon, just marvelous. You did talk a bit about China and its phenomenal economic growth and growing influence. And you talked a bit about its military. Isn't it true that the Chinese argue that they have no territorial ambitions other than to recapture Taiwan and the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands? But more important, what happens if the Chinese economy begins to deteriorate because of real estate bubbles or mammoth corruption or huge demographic problems? Won't China's influence begin to lessen?
Yes, 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 and yes. I think everything you said is right. It's a miracle that the Chinese economy hasn't hit some real bumps over the last 10 years. And lots of people have been predicting those bumps. They had lots of bank problems too. Their banks were in terrible shape 10 years ago. Now it's mainly our banks. If you want to look to countries that are doing well economically, look at Canada and Mexico. Their debt is a fraction of their GDP. Ours is now almost equal to our GDP. And they're growing at 4 or 5% in real terms a year. Canada and Mexico. Think Canada, think Mexico. We're hoping for them to invade us to teach us how to run an economy. No, you're absolutely right, and it's almost impossible for them to avoid the problems you sketch. Now, will I cry when that happens? Actually, I will, because I think that China is in a position to help us restore our economy if we become competitive again. And if we open ourselves up more to Chinese investment, not to less. Let me give you an example. One of our greatest needs, nobody disagrees with that. Even the dumbest congressman doesn't disagree with this. Our infrastructure is in desperate need of being rebuilt all across this country. And we need new infrastructure entirely. It's hard to have a modern economy without that. It just doesn't work. Rebuilding our infrastructure is one of the most job-intensive activities we could have in this country. So it helps the overall economy, and it gives jobs, millions of jobs. The Chinese, I know for a fact, are vitally interested in investing in rebuilding American infrastructure. They want to do it. And several efforts have been made and failed because as soon as the leaders of the community become aware of Chinese interests, say in helping to rebuild a bridge in San Francisco, they say, oh, they're going to put secret explosives into the bridge works and they're going to blow it up when the war comes. And we don't want them to help rebuild the waterworks, bringing water into cities, which is a big problem in most American cities, because they're going to put poison tablets in the waters and they'll have them remotely, you know, all this crazy business. Like, what was that stuff with the water and the cavities?
Fluoride.
Fluoride. You know, can't have fluoride. It's a secret Russian plot, fluoride. They don't want us to get cavities. Cavities must be good. So you get these nutty Americans saying this, and then the investments get blocked. If you want to have Chinese help in railways, which they want to make investments there too, we have this thing you may remember from the good old days called the Buy America Act that applies to all railways, and it's hard to get around that. But this is one area where they could be of enormous help to us if they remain a vibrant economy.
Thank you.
When John Kerry came home from Vietnam, he testified in the Winter Soldier hearings before the U.S. Senate. He asked who would be the last man to die for a lie. When Senator Mike Gravel was running for president in 2004, I believe, or 2008, I'm not sure, but he was in the primary, he posited the question, framed it, we spend more money for our military than the rest of the world combined. He asked, what the hell are we afraid of? He was basically ostracized from the debate from that point forward. The Koch brothers have managed to corner the market on fear and loathing. Are these things all correlated in your eyes with the dumbness of the debate? What are the permissible parameters of debate in this country now?
You know, look, I have a long time saying since my days in Washington, my earliest days in Washington, and it is, don't go into the trenches with liberals. They're just never there to fight. They're never there to fight. The only people who really fight in this town or stand up for their buddies are the conservatives. I never saw it otherwise. And it hasn't changed much ever since liberals started to call themselves progressives. They still behave the same way. I not only would have predicted how Obama would have handled these economic negotiations, I did predict it. I wrote about it within 3 months of his taking office. It was plain he wasn't going to stand up and fight. And he isn't going to. People say, well, now he is. The bargaining hasn't begun. But they just don't fight. I think it's endemic in being a liberal or a conservative. Liberals believe in principle and reason. Conservatives believe in interest and power. And that's what politics and foreign policy is about, basically. And sure, we want to have principle injected as much as possible. In our best days, it's what separated us from the other international beast. It was terrific. But it's about interest and power. When you get somebody to move, it's because you've changed their calculation of their interest. It's not because you've out-argued them. You know, I'm very, I think, incredibly highly of Joe Nye. He is one of the best scholars in our country. His book, Soft Power, drives me crazy because, you know, he's saying that the way we ought to conduct our foreign policy is to, by attraction. Other countries are attracted to the way we do things, they're going to do what we want. Or by persuasion. And so I asked Joe all the time, until he left the room before I got near him, I said, give me one example where we persuaded a foreign leader, we understood his interests better than he did. They know what their interests are, you know, unless we change the factors that go into their judgment. And liberals just don't do that. And you see it on no better issue than military issues. All during the Cold War, I consider myself conservative. All during the Cold War, I thought the Cold War was the right battle for us. And I believe so today. I think we were locked in a very serious strategic struggle with the Soviet Union that wanted ill of us, wanted to do us ill. But I never believed they were militarily superior to the United States. And any time I used to ask a senior military officer, which I did all the time, would you trade our weapons for their weapons? The answer was almost always, not a chance. Are you chinny chin chin? No?
That's correct.
Yes. There may have been one instance where they had a strategic weapon that had more punch than ours, but we still wouldn't have traded it, ours for theirs. Our technology was far superior, more reliable than theirs. Would we have traded our strategic position to theirs? They had nothing but unreliable allies who dumped them as soon as there was a possibility of dumping them. And yet, all through the Cold War, they were ahead of us. Soviet Union has gained military superiority. I fought that issue all the time. I must say, there weren't many people by my side. And you didn't have to be a liberal to do that. You just had to be an American who could have some information about this and willing to stand up and fight. But they don't do it. The only ones who fight are the ones who are wrong.
In defining our strategic interests, I think that is something that is one changing, and I was intrigued that your alma mater, the Council on Foreign Relations, just issued a report on U.S. and India. And the very first recommendation, which I thought was a joint, as you know, a joint task force, the very first recommendation was that the United States should treat India as one of its allies, but they didn't have to treat the United States as an ally. But I guess my question for you is, how would you define America's strategic interests, and how would you define an ally in the sense that we have used it, but letting the Indians off the hook in terms of how they use it?
Well, as you probably know from knowing me, Diana, I don't believe in one-way arrangements. I do want us to have close relations. You can call them allied relations with India, but I expect comparability. I don't think you can have a working relationship otherwise. For us to give them first-rate nuclear technology, for us to exempt them as we did from the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in terms of inspecting their nuclear facilities, for us to give them first-rate military technology, to me that's a big deal. And I would trust that the Indians would respond by staying in close coordination with us on a variety of very important strategic problems in that part of the world, namely Chinese interest in muscling their neighbors, and Pakistan, the unpredictable, explosive nutcase in the region. And I also have the advantage of not having read the report.
Oh, well, you should.
Let me take advantage of my role as a moderator to ask a question. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, particularly in the early phases of Iraq and Afghanistan, have offered a measure of bipartisan support for those activities. We're now in a situation in which a lot of Americans feel exhausted about Iraq, exhausted about Afghanistan. There's an increasing debate about whether these efforts were worthwhile or not. And you made the case that the military power has diminishing returns, and we have overinvested, if you will, in military power, the use of military power. Do you see this as a bipartisan problem in the United States that needs a bipartisan solution, or is the problem one way or the other politically?
In the case of Afghanistan, I think there was widespread bipartisan support for going in and smashing the Taliban regime and al-Qaeda for what they did to us. And I think that was absolutely the right decision. The question is what we did after that. The same was true in Iraq. If we were going to go in and get rid of Saddam and try to eliminate that building threat to the United States, then what did we do after that? In the case of Saddam Hussein, as bad a guy as he was the regional counterweight to Iran. That's how you had a balance of power in the Persian Gulf region. It was because Saddam Hussein, the monster, balanced off the clerical, monstrous regime in Iran. Now, if you're going to go in and get rid of him, you have to figure out what replaces him. And we have effectively destroyed the regional counterweight to Iran. And we're about to be pushed out of that country entirely now. And it makes very difficult, if not impossible, for the United States now to have a viable security policy in the Gulf region. In the case of Afghanistan, as long as our troops are there, the Taliban is not going to beat us. American troops are just formidable. And as long as they're there, we're not going to lose. But you take those troops away, and I don't think the Afghans have shown that they have the will or the skill to fight on. That's what troubles me. You know, I'm willing to help them, particularly the women there, who have been terrific. I'm willing to help them for an extended period. But they have got to demonstrate that they're prepared to fight and die for their own cause and for their own freedom. There are millions of them, and they're just, 30,000, 40,000 Taliban? They should be able to win, but they've got to fight.
So thank you very much. It's been an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.